their hopes and their dreams? Do we know the story of their lives? So this past summer, I watched a program, it's a 60 minutes documentary on YouTube, which was about one man's ancestors. This amazing documentary tells the story of an African-American man named Fred Miller, who unknowingly buys a house that reveals to him the story of his ancestors. I think we have a picture. Here's Fred Miller and his sister. Fred is a civil engineer for the Air Force, and he was living in California when his sister called him up from Virginia and told him about a big house that was for sale not far from their mother's house. And this is in rural Virginia. And so she called him up and said, Fred, remember that big house that we used to walk by when we were kids? Well, there's a for sale sign. It's this big mansion, and you know how our family always gets together. You know, they have a big ohana for gatherings and parties. The house would be perfect, Fred. Come and take a look at it. So Fred was a little reluctant, but his sister convinced him to fly out to Virginia to take a look at this house, saying that if he were to purchase it, it would be the perfect gathering place for their large extended family. The house was built in 1850, and it had a name. Its name is Shar's Wood. We have a picture of that Shar's Wood, built in 1850. So in May of 2020, after much convincing and arm twisting, Fred purchased this house, which was located on a 10-acre property. Then little by little, through research done on the house by his sister and others, including 2 historic preservationists, it was learned that Sharswood, this house, had been a large plantation in the 1800s. In fact, in back of this stately mansion, there was a dilapidated slave quarters. And just beyond the property boundary, there was a slave cemetery where one could find pointed rocks jutting out of the ground with no headstones, just pointed rocks. Further research on their family's genealogy revealed to Fred and his family that their ancestors had lived and worked as slaves on this very plantation. Fred had unknowingly become the owner of a house in which his own ancestors had been enslaved. You can imagine the shock and amazement experienced by Fred and the members of his family, which they expressed so eloquently in this documentary. Slavery had never been talked about in their family. Their slave roots had been a taboo topic that none of their elders ever mentioned. When the truth was revealed to them, it was natural that family members felt angry, they felt sad, they grieved. They had gained a knowledge of their ancestors which they did not have before. This was an awakening. Painful, yes, but also in some ways healing and restorative. In the documentary, one of Fred's cousins, I think, said, "Knowing about my ancestors made me whole. I felt a connection to them." Fred remarked that knowing about his ancestors had changed him. He wanted their story to be told and shared. He wanted to restore the slave cemetery and preserve the dilapidated slave quarters for others to come and see. So his purchasing this house had brought the family full circle. His ancestors had been slaves. Now they were the owners of this big house called Sharswood. And in the video they said they could see the hand of God. They could see the hand of their ancestors guiding them through all of this. It's really an absolutely fascinating and true story, and you can find it on YouTube. It's a 60 minutes documentary called Sharswood. This story of Sharswood really spoke to me. Roots, ancestors, their pain, their suffering, our pain, our suffering, our connection with them, my connection with my ancestors. And I have my own story to share. So I shared this story several times before, so please bear with me. Again, I share with you the story of my grandfather, Kanesaburo Oshima. So as a child, I often gazed at the portraits of my grandparents, Kanesaburo and Matsu Oshima, who were from Nagano Prefecture, Japan. I had never met them because they died before I was born. They emigrated to Hawaii from Japan in the early 1900s. This is my grandfather. Oh, my cousin Michelle is here, our grandfather. And I never knew them, but I would look at their portraits every single day growing up, because as a child, their portraits were hung in our living room. And I wondered, who are these people on the wall of our house? And my parents would say, they are your grandparents. So Kanesaburo, Grandpa Kanesaburo, was born in 1884 in Nagano Prefecture and married grandmother Matsu, also from the same prefecture, in 1913 or 1914 in Honolulu, Hawaii. First, Grandpa worked on a sugar plantation outside Hilo. Then he moved to the Kona side of this island. He became a businessman. And according to my late Uncle Susumu, Grandpa was a cook's helper. Then he became a barber, then a movie theater operator, and then started a snack store and small taxi business in the town of Kainaliu, Kona. He and my grandmother had 12 children. One of them died while still an infant. Life was difficult for them, as you can imagine. Like other Issei, first-generation immigrants, they worked from morning to night, struggling to survive in Hawaii, which was to them a foreign land. I've been told my grandparents were gentle, honest people whose lives changed suddenly the day Pearl Harbor was attacked. Around midnight on December 7, 1941, while their children were asleep, my grandfather was picked up by the police and taken to Kilauea military camp on Hawaii Island. There he was detained together with all of the Buddhist priests on this island who had been rounded up, who also had been arrested for no other reason than for holding positions of influence in their Japanese communities. From KMC, they were sent to Sand Island, Oahu, where they suffered harsh and inhumane treatment. Later that year, Grandfather found himself among 700 Japanese immigrants detained behind a barbed wire fence at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Among the 700 detainees, there were nearly 90 Buddhist priests from various sects of Buddhism: Jodo Shinshu, Jodo, Zen, Nichiren, and Shingon traditions. And thousands of miles away from home, Grandfather worried incessantly about his wife and their 11 children, wondering if he'd ever see them again. According to what I was told by the late Bishop Yokoi Matsuura, former minister of Daifukuji, who was there on May 12, 1942, Grandpa was playing a game of Hanafuda cards with some friends when he suddenly dropped his cards and began muttering, "I want to go home, I want to go home." He began walking outside toward the barbed wire fence. His friends ran outside, shouting to the guards standing in the towers. "Don't shoot, he's lost his mind. Don't shoot," they said. "He just wants to go home." Unarmed and innocent of any crime, Grandpa was shot in the back of his head. The 90 Buddhist priests in that camp conducted a funeral service for him, as well as for 3 other men who had also died in that camp. After World War II ended, my father, Noboru Oshima, the eldest of the children, went to Oklahoma to pick up grandfather's ashes and bring his urn back to Kona. His grave is here at Daifukuji Soto Mission. It's possible that Grandpa's tragic story could have been forgotten over time because the adults in my family, as far as I knew, never talked about how his life had come to an end, at least to my knowledge as a child. Like Fred Miller and his family, who had never once heard about slavery, who knew nothing about their family's painful past, it's possible that my grandfather's tragic death and the scars it left behind could have never been brought to light because nobody in that generation wanted to talk about it. Probably because it was too close and painful to them. However, things began to change. On July 20th of 2019, my grandfather was remembered by a group of 25 Buddhist priests and lay leaders who assembled in Lawton, Oklahoma, and marched in their robes in 102-degree heat with nearly 400 other protesters who were there in Oklahoma to protest the imminent confinement of up to 1,400 asylum-seeking children from Central America who had been separated from their parents and who were to be sent to Fort Sill. A Japanese-American organization called Tsuru for Solidarity was organized as part of the protest, a memorial service for Grandpa Oshima and others who died while interned at Fort Sill. The service was organized under the guidance of Reverend Dr. Duncan Ryukin Williams, a Soto Zen priest and scholar of Buddhism, and author of this book called American Sutra, a story of faith and freedom in the Second World War, which we have here in our Lending Library. So at the Fort Sill gates, the Buddhist priests set up an altar and chanted the Hanya Shingyo, which we chanted today, the Heart Sutra, led by Reverend Shumyo Kojima of Zen Shuji in LA. And placed upon this altar was a Buddhist statue carved in 1943 in an internment camp at Manzanar, and a picture of Grandpa and 3 maileles, which I had arranged to have sent from Hawaii to Fort Sill from my Oshima family. Later, the leis were draped over a cannon at the entrance to Fort Sill as a peace offering. All of this made me think about intergenerational suffering. The photos and videos which were shared with me of the protests really made me aware of this deep intergenerational suffering, which I think I carried in my heart, and perhaps other members of my family had also carried in their hearts, maybe even unknowingly. So it moved me to know that Grandpa Oshima had become the face of injustice, that his death served as a reminder to all that the forced, unjust removal and incarceration of innocent people must never happen again in the United States. I'd like to share some photos with you. So, to my amazement, my spiritual connection with Grandpa Oshima has continued to unfold and deepen. Last weekend, on Saturday, September 24th, upon special invitation, I flew to Los Angeles to participate in a ceremony at the Japanese American National Museum. So there I am standing in front of, they call it JANM, Japanese American National Museum. A ceremony was held to formally install a book called the Ire-cho. Ire means to console the spirit. Cho is like a book or a directory. The Ire-cho is a book of names which contains the names of 125,274 persons of Japanese ancestry and their families who were incarcerated in at least one of 75 camps during the World War II era. I had the privilege of participating in a procession on the grounds of the museum. So this is a picture of my friend, someone whom I deeply respect, Reverend Dr. Duncan Lucan Williams, who headed this event and who's the author of the book American Sutra. So this museum, if you have an opportunity to visit it, I would say it's really worth visiting. And prior to the ceremony, my cousin Jody Nakasuji, who was also invited to attend the ceremony, and I had a chance to look at the exhibit called Sutra and Bible. And part of the exhibit, they had these large Toba wooden memorial tablets. One tablet for each of the sites of incarceration, for each of the internment camps. So you'll see there's one for Fort Sill. So we were all sort of divided into groups. There were 3 of us representing the internees of Fort Sill camp. There's my cousin Jody Nakasuji in the photo on the left, holding a photo of Grandpa Oshima. And the 3rd person in our group representing Fort Sill was Mary Ekemezi. She represented the American Indian Movement, Indian Territory, the indigenous peoples of Fort Sill. And it was Mary who had collected soil, a sample of soil from Fort Sill, and sent it to the museum. So there was soil from all 75 wartime incarceration camps, had been collected and sent to the museum. So there was a procession, you can see there. So Mary carried the toba for Fort Sill, and in that kind of a vial, you can see the soil, or looks like rocks, sand from Fort Sill, Oklahoma. It reminded me of our 33 Kannon Osunafumi pilgrimage, where we stepped on the soil from each of the 33 temples in Japan. It's like this physical connection with the very earth from those places. We have another. So there's a short video of the procession. And the Ire-cho, this book of names, serves as a national monument of sorts. And according to Reverend Duncan Lucan Williams, the Book of Names is meant to not simply be a repository of remembrance, but an interactive monument to heal the racial fractures and to heal the history of the United States. So we had a chance, Jody and I had a chance to fill out something like a postcard there. So we each filled out a card in memory of our grandfather. So there's a short video which we'd like to share, just 2 minutes.
persons of Japanese ancestry gathered 80 years ago. We now proclaim the Ide-cho as a national monument to the wartime incarceration by opening the cover of the sacred book of names. We carry with us the gate of wood, the wooden tablets on which the names of 75 U.S. internment and concentration camps are recorded. By bringing forth the very soil of incarceration by camp survivors, descendants, those associated with the preservation and education about the camps, and clergy and faith leaders.
From the bombing of Pearl Harbor that shattered our everyday lives, we remember. From the roundup and imprisonment of our Issei leaders, priests, ministers, and community leaders, we remember. From the signing of Executive Order 9066 that forced our evacuation.
I hope you remember that this book represents people. There are people in this audience whose names are in this book. There are people in this audience whose families are in this book. There are people in this audience whose friends and loved ones are in this book. But they have put their stamp next to their family's name, their friend's name, to remember them and acknowledge them.
Thank you, Amy. What was really wonderful is that for each camp, there was a clergy assigned to the group. So there were Buddhist priests from different traditions, and Christian ministers, pastors from different traditions, Shinto priests. We were all there to support this installation of the Ide-cho, this monument of names. So for me, just like for Fred Miller of Sharswood, this is a story of my ancestors. And while it's a story of pain and injustice, it's really also a wonderful story about remembrance, a story about healing, and a story of roots, a story that healing from racial injustice is possible, that transformation is possible, that we can awaken together and have awareness. The pain and violence suffered by one's ancestors is often silently carried in an invisible stream through successive generations of descendants. We don't know it's there. We don't know how we are being harmed by it. Until one day, the story is told. It is brought to light, acknowledged, even honored. And then the healing begins. This is both powerful and transformative. So I have two more pictures I want to share of our Elsa Kandam. So, but anyway, on loan at the Japanese American National Museum is a small kano-sama, wooden kano-sama, which would normally sit on our altar here. And it was thought to have been carved in some internment camp during World War II. We don't know which camp, we don't know its story, we don't know who carved it or for whom it was carved. But on the back of this wooden figure are the letters E-L-S-A, Elsa. Very small, neatly carved. And so we started calling it the Elsa Kanna. It was really interesting because during the pandemic, this kanna would call to me when nobody's here, the temple was closed, but as if to say, please find out my history. And then I got a call from Dr. Tanabe over in Honolulu saying the Japanese American National Museum would like to borrow your Elsa Kandam. So would it be okay? So we said okay, and it was shipped very carefully to the museum. and it sits in the museum now. And Jody and I were able to see it. It sparked a lot of interest, but so far nobody has come forth to say, I recognize that piece. I thought maybe the Elsa Kano wanted to go home to Elsa, but so far we don't know. Nobody has said anything about it, but I've been told it has sparked a lot of interest. So thank you for listening to my long story. I wanted to really share with you the experience that I had at this museum, because it was not just my experience, but it was a very powerful ritual, I think, that was for everyone, for all of us in the United States, and certainly for all of those who have ancestors who were in those camps of incarceration. So thank you, and you're getting hungry, so I will close my talk. Namu Kie Butsu, Namu Kie Ho, Namu Kie So. We take refuge in the Buddha, we take refuge in the Dharma, we take refuge in the Sangha.